Welcome to the first of our Nutritionist 2020. I'm Marianne Fessenden from AMTS, and we have an exciting group of people joining us this year. I can't wait for you to catch everybody. As a reminder, for those of you who are listening, our format is going to be to deliver a presentation that is pre-recorded at 2 times on the webinar day, and the presenter joins us at the end of each session to answer the questions from the listening audience. These webinars are multinational. I have several co-hosts, depending on which you're listening to, that are delivering the presentations translated in their country's languages, and or they field questions from their countrymen. This morning, I am glad to say I'm joined by Elena Bonfante of Italy, Vadim Bekchevnikov of Russia. I'm expecting Sean Lee from China, Marcelo Ramos from Brazil, and Paula Turillo this afternoon. Marcos Neves Pierre of Universidade Federal de Lavras in Brazil often sends us questions for the Portuguese audience. While some of the co-hosts may not be able to rebroadcast in their own language, their questions give an opportunity for consideration of viewpoints of concerns in different farming systems. Depending on how you are listening, you can submit queries through me or one of my attending co-hosts. Later, a complete recording of archived webinars, as well as a question and answer session for each, will be available on the AMTS website. For those of you who would listen to the presentations whilst driving, we have converted the videos to MP3 files that can be downloaded for offline listening. Those podcasts can be found at the Ag Model Systems website under the Webinar tab or the Resources tab. Our goal with the Nutritionist webinar series is to bring information about ruminant nutrition that is important to you. Sometimes these talks are about hot topics everyone is talking about, and sometimes the talks focus on issues we should be thinking and talking about. Sometimes our speakers are well-known researchers and experts who are familiar with nearly everyone in the field, and sometimes our speakers are new and not yet well-known. Our speaker this month ticks a couple of those boxes. Jonas DeSouza is a technical service manager for Perdue Agribusiness Animal Nutrition, focusing his work on fatty acid nutrition. He grew up in Chapico, South Brazil, and received his BS degree in animal science from Santa Catarina State University in 2011. During his master's at the University of Sao Paulo in Brazil, he focused his research on essential fatty acid supplementation on performance and metabolism of grazing cows. So those of you who are working in grazing systems, he probably can give you some answers. With his background in lipid metabolism, he expanded on his expertise while at Michigan State University under the guidance of Dr. Adam Locke, where he examined the impact of altering the dietary ratio of fatty acids on performance and metabolism of dairy cows. He received his PhD degree in animal science from Michigan State University in 2018. Jonas presently serves as Technical Services Manager for Perdue Agribusiness, one of our sponsors. His topic today is fatty acid nutrition during the transition period. So please now enjoy Jonas's presentation. Remember to jot any questions you have during the presentation and type them in the Q&A window or the chat window. We'll have an opportunity for Jonas to answer these questions after the presentations. And right now, I am going to switch over to our pre-recorded presentation.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Jonas DeSouza, and today I'll be talking a little bit about fatty acid nutrition during the transition period. First of all, I would like to thank Marianne and AMTS for inviting me to give this talk about this topic. So fatty acid nutrition is one of my areas of expertise, and we're talking a little bit about how we evaluate different strategies, what is the main results in terms of different fatty acids, what they do when we add those fatty acids in the diet, and why we should, it's important to focus during the transition period. So to get started, what is the transition period? What's the definition? Usually we define the transition period, that period between 21 days or 3 weeks pre-calving to 3 weeks post-calving in a dairy cow. So there's a lot of physiological and metabolic change that happen during this time. And one of the main changes that happen after calving around this period is the huge demand for nutrients that increase during this period. So if we compare, here's an example, if we compare a 30-kilogram cow, when that cow is milking at the beginning of lactation versus pregnancy, there's about 3 times an increase in the glucose requirement, twice as much amino acids, and 4.5 times fatty acids. Of course, we know that what happened during this period, because this increase in demand for not only energy, amino acids, and minerals, is the cows enters in a negative nutrient balance. It's not only a negative energy balance, but lately we've seen more research on the effects of other dietary components also being important during this period. So because of this increase in demand, especially after calving, the cows usually mobilize reserves, lose condition at the beginning of lactation to try to accommodate this metabolic situation. When that mobilization of body reserves is extreme, and due to other challenges that these cows may have during early lactation, this could result in situations of increasing inflammation and oxidative stress that could affect lactation performance. So that's why there is a lot of focus on this period, because basically that can determine the success of that lactation curve based on what we do at that transition period. Since we talk about nutrients and energy and fat being fatty acids being essential nutrients in dairy cow diet, there is concerns and a lot of questions about if we should be feeding fat or fatty acids at early lactation. And the thinking behind this is, if cows are in a negative energy balance, why we don't density up the energy on the diet feeding more fat. But if we look to the literature, and most of the work done in late 80s and early 90s, they would say that perhaps we shouldn't be including fat at the beginning of lactation for these cows. This is well summarized in this classic book, The Large Dairy Herd Management, in the chapter that was prepared by Dr. Groomer, where he would point out that fat probably should be left out from the diet in early postpartum, because most of the trials that he summarized have indicate very little benefits of feeding fat at the beginning 5 to 7 weeks of lactation. And he identified that the major factor in that case was because why probably the cows are not responding to the supplemental fat is depression of feed intake. So when they were feeding the fat in early lactation, usually feed intake drops, so the advantage of having a more dense energy on the diet was not resulting in greater energy intake in the cows. What I have to point out about this summary of the studies done by Grummer is that these studies were all feeding very high levels of fat, diets with 4 or 5% of added fat or added supplemental fat on the diet. And we have to understand that sometimes the difference between the poison and the medicine is the dose. So really, I'll try to question that, when we interpret in fat or fatty acid nutrition, making sure what's the level we're feeding is important. And I think a lot of the initial trials that did not show benefit of supplementing fat was because of the high level of fat being fed. So one of the important points to mention when we talk about fatty acid metabolism is, some people believe that we should not be feeding supplemental fat for cows in negative energy balance because there is already too much fat circulating. And you know that's true. You know, during early lactation, during that transition period, is where you're going to have the highest mobilization during the lactation cycle in a cow. You're going to have higher non-esterified fatty acids or NEFA circulating. But when we think about metabolism of fatty acids, we have to remember that the fat that we feed on the diet usually is absorbed and will circulate as a triglyceride in chylomicrons and VLDL in the body, which is quite different than what happens when the cow is mobilizing and has readily available fatty acids as NEFA. So we have to understand that the metabolism of these fatty acids are different from what we feed on a diet and what is being mobilized by the cow. And again, I will make a point about, I don't think is about having or not having fat, higher level fat on the diet or mobilizations. I think it's about the degree, you know, what's the degree of that mobilization and what's the fat level that we are feeding. And I think one of the biggest advancements that we have in terms of fatty acid nutrition is that we should probably stop talking about feeding fat to cows and being specific. And my presentation from this point is going to be focused about fatty acids and not fat. Is because understanding that different fatty acids, they have different metabolic effects, it's important. So in a conventional diet, or in most of the diets, I would say those 5 fatty acids that I listed on the top here, palmitic, stearic, oleic, linoleic, and linolenic are the 5 major fatty acids that we have on the diet. So I will mention, I will focus my presentation, talk about their effects of feeding these fatty acids during the transition period. And I will add here EPA and DHA in this case, because during the transition period, there's more advantage of feeding some of these omega-3 fatty acids. But when we consider fat nutrition, we should be talking about what fatty acids are feeding, understanding that their effect on the rumen in terms of biohydrogenation, on the kinetics of digestion of other dietary components like starch and fiber is not equal. That the digestibility of these fatty acids in the small intestine is not the same as well. Their effect on feed intake is not the same, and how they are partitioning to different organs is not the same. So, you know, you have fatty acids that will be partitioned to a great degree to the mammary gland and be part of the milk fat, other fatty acids that will be more used at the adipose tissue, and overall how these fatty acids will be used between different tissues and organs will determine the effect that we will see, the response that we will see in the cow. So I will summarize here some of the latest research in fatty acid nutrition, and I divided my presentation by the effects of different fatty acids. As I said, I think it's important to focus on what that fatty acid is and what it can do. And my summary here will be focused on different fatty acids. So to start with, I will start with supplements. When we supplement palmitic and stearic acid together. So palmitic and stearic are 2 probably most important saturated fatty acids that we have in the dairy cow diet and dairy cow metabolism. And I will show you here 4 different trials where these supplements were feeding either pre-calving or post-calving or in combination. Okay, so this first experiment here, it was done in Israel, and they had an objective here of feeding different combination of fatty acids here, either pre or post calving. So the control here would be, or the blue bar here indicating on the graph, would be the control diet that did not have any supplemental fat. And then they used 2 other strategies with the same palmitic stearic acid supplement here. So they fed the fat control was feeding that fat pre-calving, so previous to calving, and then after calving, that those cows go into a control diet, or fed during pre and post calving. So and they feed this supplement at about 230 grams per day, which was almost 1% of diet dry matter in these cows. And they feed this for at the end of gestation, about 256 days of gestation until 21 days of lactation. So focus on that transition period. Okay. So when we look to the results here, what happened with feed intake on these cows is when we feed fat, or when we feed this particular palmitic stearic acid supplement here, there was a decrease in feed intake. This is the DMI after calving. So what is showing here that degree of decrease in feed intake also increases when of the timing of supplementation. So when we feed that supplement throughout the whole transition period, feed intake decreases to a greater degree than only feeding pre-calf. It's interesting that 3.5 fat correct milk went to the opposite direction of feed intake, and those cows actually increase fat correct milk in early lactation when we feed this palmitic stearic acid supplement. Because of this decrease in feed intake and increase in fat correct milk, you probably can already realize what happened with the energy balance. So, the idea that if I feed palmitic and stearic acid supplement or fat in general to help with energy balance is really contradicted, I would say. And as you can see here, as we feed that fat, that supplement, either pre-calving or pre and post-calving, we actually put those cows in a more negative energy balance because they increase the fat correct milk to a greater extent than and decrease DMI in this trial. NIFA is a measurement of body fat mobilization. I think it's a little bit tricky to interpret NIFA when we're feeding fat, because some of the NIFA can come from the metabolism of that fat that we fed on the diet. But overall, the NIFA increase, which is in agreement more or less of what happened with the energy balance here. So the next study is again a palmitic stearic acid supplement fed only on early lactation here. So this is not pre-calving, it's only post-calving. So they start feeding when the cows calved and fed about a higher level than the previous study, about 2.3% of diet dry matter, and feed for a longer period. They fed for the first 6 weeks of lactation. Which is interesting for me in this study is that they saw this treatment by time interaction, and that happened until about 4 weeks. What happened is feed intake, similar to the previous study, was lower for that palmitic stearic acid group until about 4 weeks of lactation. So this would agree with some of the early research suggesting, well, perhaps we should be looking of timing of supplementation as well. So this brings up another point about when we should be introducing these supplements on the diet. This, of course, was a higher level than the previous study. This is a study done in Cornell, and did not show too much benefit of feeding that type of supplement at the beginning of lactation. This is a study that was done in California. It was a similar study from the first one that I showed, where they fed pre-calving up to post-calving. The difference here is the post-calving was only until 10 days of lactation. Here, of course, these diets from these 3 studies are different, and that's one of the points to try to get studies across different dietary conditions for us to have a better reading of what's happening under different basal diets. what they observed here is an increase in prepartum intake, but not postpartum intake. And in this case, they did not observe any effect on milk or fat, and with that, also no changes in body conditioning score at the beginning of lactation, so no statistical differences, no differences as well in MIFA, and they were able to do liver biopsies and measure hepatic triglyceride concentration, and also did not observe differences here when feeding or not feeding this type of supplement. And if you look to the feeding rate here, it was similar to the feeding rate from the first trial that I showed you. And finally, my fourth study here, again with a palmitic stearic acid supplement in early lactation. This was done at Michigan State. This is the probably the latest paper that we have with this type of supplement in early lactation. The idea here was not only feeding, not feeding 0% fat or feeding 2% of the supplement after calving for the first 29 days of lactation, but also evaluating that under different forage NADF levels. So they had basically a factorial arrangement here where they feed or not fat with 20 or 26% of forage NADF on the diet. Which is interesting for me about this study is that there is an interaction between the forage level and the supplementation this particular fatty acid supplementation here at their lactation. So what they observe, if you look to feed intake here, they tend to observe an increase on feed intake on those cows fed this type of supplement, but that was not completely, but a decrease actually in the milk yield. So when we look where that energy went, if they're tending to eat more and milk production is going down, is these cows lose less condition and improve energy balance in early lactation. So that's the overall response observed in the study, but that was actually dependent on the level of forage. So if we look here to the gray continuous line here is going to be the 20% forage NADF with 2% of fatty acid group. As we can see, that group tend to have higher intake, and it was the group that lose less condition at the beginning of lactation and had a better energy balance, but that was accomplished because the cows had a much lower milk production. So if we look here, by when these cows are peaking here, and this, as I said, this experiment was feeding these supplements into 29 days in milk, and after that, putting these cows in a common carryover diet, so all the cows receive the same diet. And as we can see here, that is about 10 kilograms difference between the group that receive 20% of forage NADF, 2% of this supplement, and the group that received 20% of forage NADF without that supplement, meaning that the improvement that these cows had in terms of energy balance and body condition was at the expense of milk production. So in summary, I would say that when we consider these palmitic stearic acid supplements and show 4 different trials here, there is an inconsistent response about their effects during early lactation, or pre-calving and post-calving. I would say that the idea that we are feeding fat to improve energy balance is really not validated by the research. You know, most of the studies did not observe an advantage. Actually, the only study that I show from this 4, the last one, as I said, was at the expense of milk. Which is important for us to consider is, you know, I gave 4 different examples here with very different dietary conditions, and that is potential interaction with other dietary factors. That's probably why, as well, we see some of these inconsistent on the response. And this is a factor that I think we should do, try to understand better in terms of research, what interacts with that fatty acid supplementation strategy. Another point is production level. We've seen lately that in some of recent research shown that the production level is important when we are evaluating different fat supplements, and we should take that into consideration as well here. So the next group that I will talk about in terms of fatty acid is palmitic acid. So specifically in US, they get very popular in the last few years, especially because since in US mostly we are paid based on the yield of components, and the yield of butterfat increase, paid for butterfat increase in the last 5 years. And these supplements, they are very popular for that, right? They become popular for that. So there was a lot of research done in the last 10 years with these palmitic acid supplements. With their major response that's very consistent across the studies is increases in milk fat. And this was summarized here, what we did a few years ago. This increase in milk fat seems to be independent of the level of production. So across a wide production level, we've seen about the same production response or milk fat yield response when we're feeding these palmitic acid supplements. And because of the increase in milk fat, the major response is an increase in fat-correct milk and energy-correct milk. This is a summary that we did when I was at Michigan State a few years ago, where I summarized 12 studies from Dr. Adam Locke lab and Dr. Mike Allen, that were probably the two first researchers to look at palmitic acid. And there was a very consistent increase in energy-correct milk across studies here. And I would like to point out, these are all in post-peak cows. These are not preferred lactation cows. And of course, this gave us the curiosity to say, okay, what happens to our lactation cows? Do they respond the same or do they not? So there is very few research that actually done with palmitic acid in our lactation cow. I'm trying to summarize here what we know. This is one of the trials, and I don't consider these a palmitic acid supplementation trial, because what the authors were trying to look here was comparing a glucogenic diet against a lipogenic diet in early lactation. So you can see that the levels of starch is tremendously different between these two diets, also the total NEDF. But the way that they did this lipogenic diet was having a palmitic acid enriched supplement in this diet. So, as I said, we don't have too much research with palmitic acid, but this will give us an indication of what it does. What they observed feeding this glucogenic versus a lipogenic diet was no effect on feed intake, an increase or a tendency for an increase in fat and protein correct milk here, no difference in body weight loss at the beginning of lactation, but when we look to some of the metabolic variables here, NIF and DHB were higher on the lipogenic diet, not to, I would say, to a degree that started to be a concern. Insulin was lower. That's probably more related with the starch level that the glucogenic diet had higher, but especially the liver triglyceride that they measure is also higher on that lipogenic diet. So summary here, basically, that increase in tendency for increasing energy-correct milk on this lipogenic diet was lined up with the research that we have on cows receiving this type of supplement post-peak. So because of this lack of research, specifically palmitic acid, I'm going to show you one of the research trials from my PhD work. We looked to palmitic acid response. That was, of course, concerns because of the negative energy balance with, adding a palmitic acid that potentially drives milk fat yield would put cows in a more negative energy balance. Would we have any issues with feed intake and near lactation, as some of the previous research with other types of fat have indicated? And would that, be a risk for metabolic disease? So we did this trial to look not only if we should be feeding that palmitic acid, but when should we introduce. So basically, we have cows on a controlled diet here that did not receive that supplemental fat, or receiving palmitic acid enriched supplement at 1.5% of diet dry matter at early lactation, for the first 24 days of lactation. So from calving to 24 days. So on the day 25th, we split those cows, and cows that were in that control group, they either continues on that control group, or we switch them to the palmitic acid group, and the same with the palmitic acid. So basically, is a factor with timing of feeding here. So let's look to some of the results here. So when we look feed intake, feed intake was one of our concerns. That was basically here at the beginning of lactation. So feeding for those first 24 days of lactation did not affect feed intake. As you can see, feed intake increases by week here, but there was no difference between treatments. When we look to milk yield, there was no difference on milk yield on that after calving period, the first 24 days of lactation. Although numerically here, the palmitic acid group is higher, there was no statistical difference. Similarly, when we look to feed intake on what we call peak period here, so after those 24 days, until 10 weeks of lactation, we also did not observe differences on feed intake. You see feed intake increased nicely here on these cows as lactation progress, but we did see an increase on milk yield for the cows that received palmitic acid during that peak period. So we did see that the time, manner, or the time of introduction of that fat supplement was important. So when we feed that palmitic acid after those first 24 days of lactation, we did see an increase on milk production that we did not observe on the first 3 weeks. And regardless if we feed or not, as you can see, both groups here with the black bars here, they respond the same. If we feed or not in the first 24 days did not make a difference on the response after that. So fat yield, we observe a consistent response on fat yield here, in both periods, both feeding the first 24 days of lactation and feeding after those 24 days of lactation. And as you can see, the magnitude of response was about the same. So across the period here. But when we consider comparing to the studies that we did with cows at postpartum, the increase in fat yield was about twice as much than what usually we observe with the feeding these supplements during post-peak period, I would say, not postpartum period, sorry. And of course, because of this increase in fat yield, we did see a nice response on energy-corrected milk. So again, this was consistent throughout the supplementation period. So we saw that increase in energy-corrected milk in both the first 24 days of lactation and also after those 24 days of lactation. So the increase in both fat and energy-corrected milk was consistent across the timing here. One interesting factor here, one of the negative consequences of feeding this palmitic acid was an increase in body weight loss at the beginning of lactation. So as I showed before, we didn't see an effect on intake. There was this huge increase in energy-corrected milk, but partially that increase in fat and energy-corrected milk on the first 24 days of lactation was because cows did lose more condition at the beginning of lactation. So as you can see here, the first 24 days is where we see a greater body weight loss for that palmitic acid group. There was no difference after those 24 days. So really, this indicates to us that, you know, it's important to consider the timing to understand what it does in terms of metabolism. So it only happened on the beginning of lactation, but partially that increase in energetic milk was because the cows mobilized more body fat or more reserves at early lactation. There is some when we look to the metabolites here, we did see lower plasma insulin, higher levels of NIFA and BHB for the cows that receive or were fed with palmitic acid here. Although these levels here, you know, if you consider some of the benchmarks, they are modest increases, but they complement some of the data showing that the cows lose more condition at the beginning of lactation. And when we think about energy, right, when we feed more palmitic acid, what happens is that milk energy output increase, and that did not help with energy balance. You know, it's actually put the cows in a more negative energy balance state. And as I said, that happened mainly at those first 3 weeks of lactation. So for palmitic acid, I would say that, yeah, we did see an increase in energetic milk, a very good response in energetic milk. Usually the response is twice, it can be, you know, twice as much the response that we see in post-peak cows with no effect on feed intake. But partially this increase in energetic milk is because cows lose more condition at the beginning of lactation. If that, we haven't done any work with reproduction here to see if that has any, we know that cows that lose condition usually have problems or more likely to have problems associated with reproduction. We didn't measure at this study. I think this should be something interesting to be measured in future trials here. But we also have to consider that the magnitude of the body weight loss, it was although the cows lose more condition, was not a big body weight loss. You know, you can argue of how much the cows lose here, if it matters or not on those first 24 days of lactation. And again, for most of the production response, we did not see an interaction here, but it's important to consider when we are feeding these supplements to these cows. Okay, so now I will talk a little bit about palmitic, but together with oleic acid supplementation, and this has been one of the, I would say, new lines of research lately. There is a lot of interest on this, on oleic acid because of its metabolic effect. When we started doing some of our work, when I was at Michigan State, we did see that, you know, this is unpublished data, but cows tended to partition more energy towards milk when we feed palmitic acid. There was this nice relationship here that we did. And was interesting at the same time when we're plotting different fatty acids from a data set that we have, that oleic acid had the opposite effect in terms of partition more nutrient to reserves. So that gives an indication to say, okay, perhaps we shouldn't be feeding, perhaps we should be feeding these two fatty acids in combination, palmitic and oleic, to these fresh cows if the objective is to driving, you know, some energy to milk, but also keeping condition in the cows. There was some of our previous work in post-peak cows showing a positive relationship between changing body weight and the content of oleic acid in adipose tissue, and also between insulin and this change in the adipose tissue levels of oleic acid. So this led us to the hypothesis that, you know, perhaps combining these two fatty acids with in our lactation would be a better strategy. So we did a trial to actually evaluate these two different fatty acids and the ratio or the combination between them. So this is a trial we did. In this trial here, we only fed cows for the first 24 days of lactation with a fat supplement, a fatty acid supplement. After those 24 days, we put the cows in the same carryover diet. So the cows receive the same carryover diet. So they receive 4 different diets here: control diet, no supplemental fat. What a 80-10 is a supplement that delivers 80% palmitic, 10% of oleic. The remaining 10% are other fatty acids, or the other fatty acids, stearic, linoleic. So a little bit of each of the other fatty acids. The 720 was we increased 10 units of oleic, dropping 10 units of palmitic. In the 630, we increased the other 10 units here on oleic, dropping another 10 units in palmitic. So let's look what happened in the cows here. So similar to the previous study, so that 80-10 is very close to a high palmitic, or most of the palmitic acid supplements, or palmitic acid enriched supplements in the market. So you observed a very similar response from what happened on the study that I showed previously. We did not observe changes on feed intake. We did see about 5 kilograms increase on energy-correct milk here, but the cows did lose more condition as well, very similar to what happened to that first study that we did. But what was interesting here, as we increased the level of the oleic acid to 20% or 30%, dropping palmitic acid in the supplemental fat, we did see a tendency for the cows eating more during that early lactation period. By the second week, we did not see differences on energy-correct milk. Really, the differences were at that first week. So there was a similar increase in energy-correct milk, and the cows did not lose extra conditions. So if we get the 630 here, we had the highest intake. They were as high as the other 2 treatments in energy-correct milk, and did not lose extra condition in early lactation. So this was really exciting for us, showing, okay, perhaps this is more likely to result in success during the transition period as a feeding strategy, using combinations between palmitic and oleic as the 2 major fatty acids here on our fat blends. When we look to NIFA, the NIFA follows more or less the same what we observe with body weight on these cows here. NIFA was higher in the cows on 80-10, lower on 630. BHB kind of follow the same, a different, an opposite pattern actually. We see higher BHB on the cows on 630, and also higher insulin. So the insulin is an interesting effect here. We do believe that partially the effects that the oleic acid has in early lactation is mediated by this effect in insulin metabolism. Now we'll explore a little bit more on that. Okay. After those first 24 days, we put all cows on the same diet. They received the same diet here. And what we see here was an increase, was a carryover effect actually. So when we stopped feeding fat, that was still a response for those 3 groups that received one of the 3 fatty acid supplemental strategies here, showing to us that really, we should be considering feeding fat on those first 24 days, because that has a carryover effect on energy-correct milk, at least until those first 10 weeks where we measure that. And body weight, kind of specifically on that 80-10, start to recovering after we take that out from the diet. This is a unpublished trial that was just finished at MSU, and is also this focus only on this 630 or 60% palmitic, 30% oleic, but also consider when we are feeding this supplement. It is interesting here that they observe about the same response on managed direct milk on those first 24 days of lactation, and then they also look to timing, if it was only from those first 24 days or if you should feed for the first 10 weeks. And as we can see here, the response seems to be better, this fast group here, when we feed throughout those first 10 weeks of lactation. So kind of confirming this previous study that I showed you, that the 630 had an advantage of increasing energy for milk. No, I'm not showing here, but there was no difference in body weight loss as well during this period. So while oleic acid, as I said, is really the oleic acid. When you're feeding, are you sure that's oleic acid or not? So this is also a trial that was finished at MSU, Michigan State, looking to oleic acid in fresh cows. And to make sure that this oleic acid, what they did here is that they abomasally infused oleic acid at 60 grams per day for the first 15 days of lactation, and they looked to adipose tissue to do some measurements to see what was the effect of oleic acid into the adipose tissue. So very interesting data here. This is also unpublished data. This is coming from both Dr. Locke and Dr. Contreras' lab. Is interesting here. So they did a biopsy pre-partum in 14 days. As I said, they start to infuse, and the first day or calving, and went for 15 days. Then so they did 2 biopsies, one at day 6 and one at day 12. It's interesting here, looking to the glycerol release. So this is, if you have more glycerol release, it means that you have more body mobilization in the adipose tissue. So you have more fat, more lipolysis happening in the adipose tissue. And as we can see here, oleic acid reduce, so the infusion of oleic acid reduce that mobilization in the adipose tissue in our lactation. And why is probably doing that is because this effect on insulin. So they did this test to measure insulin sensitivity on the adipose tissue and saw that both at 6 and 12 days there is an improvement on insulin sensitivity of the adipose tissue from the cows that were infused with oleic acid. So this is probably what is associated with this response that we observe in feeding trials. Oleic acid may have an effect on insulin sensitivity, and that's probably why we see this response on cows eating more at early lactation and also respond better in terms of production. So I would say that in summary, what we observe with the palmitic, or the recent research of palmitic and oleic, is an increase in energy for milk, reducing some of this body weight loss at the beginning of lactation, and probably this is driving by this effect on insulin sensitivity that happens on adipose tissue. So finally, I'll just touch briefly on omega fatty acids here. They also are a popular strategy that you can use. I would say the biggest benefits that we see is when we vary the ratio between omega-6 and omega-3 in our lactation's effects on production and reproduction. So this is a study coming from Florida, where what they did here was altering the ratio between omega-6 to omega-3. So the R4, R5, and R6 is the ratio. So as the R4 has more omega-3 in relationship to omega-6 here. As you can see here, there is a positive effect when we do that. These treatment diets were fed from 14 days of lactation here. And as you can see, there was a positive effect on feed intake and a positive effect on fat-correct milk in these cows. So kind of a similar effect of the omega-3 from the oleic acid from the work done at Michigan State, where the key is changes in metabolism that result in changes in feed intake, with results in either improvements in milk or energy balance in these cows. Another study here coming from Florida showing different strategies of feeding omega-6 and omega-3 pre and post calving. So basically they had a factorial design here, either feeding calcium salt of PFAD, as you look to the composition here, oleic and palmitic as major fatty acid that supplement, or safflower oil, a source of omega-6 in this case. And after calving, either using that PO as a control diet or feeding an omega-3 source with fish oil. Which is interesting here is that as we look, is feeding EPA and DHA through that fish oil after calving decreased pregnancy loss, and really this seems to be, the effect seems to be better if the cows receive an omega-6 pre-calving. So here the better strategy was feeding omega-6, that's usually pro-inflammatory fatty acids pre-calving, and omega-3s, that's an anti-inflammatory fatty acid post-calving. And similar, here another study coming from the same group showing benefits. Those first two trials were done feeding a supplement as a calcium salt. Here is feeding an algae product, and they also see benefits where in terms of milk production response and pregnancy rates when feeding that DHA, that omega-3 fatty acids. So in a really briefly summary, omega-3 seems to be better when supplemented during early lactation, and I would say most of the benefits is when that increase intake. Changing that omega-6 and omega-3 can result in benefits in reproduction. More omega-6 pre-calving, more omega-3 post-calving, really show benefits on doing that. And I think the question is how can we combine this with other fatty acid strategies? How can we? And I think this is probably one of the future research lines, is how can we use and complement the effects of omega-3, for example, with palmitic, with oleic, or stearic, with other fatty acids as well. So I hope most of my presentation, what I try to focus was saying that when you're feeding fat or fatty acids in this case, they are much more than calories. You shouldn't be so concerned, in terms of you feeding fat for energy. No, you need to understand the specific effects that different fatty acids will have. And I hope I show that, different fatty acids will result in different response in terms of milk and milk components, in condition, and reproduction health. So it's about understanding what you're feeding, what fatty acids you're feeding, and understanding that they're not only calories, that they change metabolism, and that's probably more important, that changing metabolism is actually calories of the fatty acid. And as a final consideration, I would say that I do believe that fatty acids should be considered in diets for transition cows. You need to understand what fatty acids are you feeding, what their effects, and when you're designing your nutrition products, including or not, you should include the fatty acid to reach a specific goal or specific objective. So that's why it's important to consider the fatty acid effect and not the fat effect. Okay, and I would say it's important when you look to the research is looking to what the individual fatty acids do, what commercial supplements can bring those fatty acids, and that production performance, it has to take into consideration when that fat was fed, what's the production level in different diets. And of course, there is tangible factors that we cannot measure, and that becomes complicated, a little bit more complicated in our decision, but they are also important. Body weight, condition, and reproduction also should be considered when you're evaluating these fatty acids here. So I'd like to thank you for the time. Thank you, the MTS, for the opportunity here. And I'm leaving you two of my emails if anyone has anything specific questions, and I'll be happy to answer the questions now.
Thank you, Jonas. Before we start with questions, I will introduce our next month's speaker, Dr. Jesse Golf from Iowa State University College of Veterinary Medicine, where one of his areas of focus was preventing milk fever in dairy cows. He became a professor emeritus in 2019, so he now works on his own to develop research ideas into commercial products for man and animal. Jesse's talk next month will be an update on strategies to limit hypoglycemia in fresh cows on farms. As with this webinar, there will be 2 opportunities to join. Keep in mind, the United States is switching to daylight savings time. Does not affect our 9 o'clock webinar, but our webinars will move to 6 p.m. for the remainder of the season, excepting November. So again, we'll be running our webinars at 9 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time and 6 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time next month. As you know, these webinars take a lot of work and cooperation. The webinars are organized and produced by AMTS USA and Global. Our longtime collaborator is Paula Turillo of IFINA, who hosts a series as El Webinar del Nutritionista. She receives support from Guillermo Lehman, Technal, Rock River Laboratory, Bioterre, and Concar. She has the excellent translation skills of Paula Alanes backing her up in the Spanish language webinar. We also thank our AMTS distributors. In Italy, Elena Bonfante is terrific about joining us nearly every time. In China, we have Sean Lee from Ansai Tech. In Brazil, we have Marcelo Hens Ramos, director of 3R Lab. And in Russia, we have Vadim Bekchevnikov of Novolab. And I'm sorry I left out, Elena is with Dairy Innovations Italia. Our webinars are made better by wonderful questions submitted by Marcos Neves Pereira of Universidade Federal de Lavras in Brazil. We are especially thankful for our generous sponsors who make it possible for us to get great speakers and manage the program. We thank our gold sponsor, Arm & Hammer Animal Health, makers of cattle feed ingredients that optimize dairy cow health, and the Canola Council of Canada. Learn more about feeding canola at canolamazing.com. Our silver sponsors are Ajinomoto Heartland, Superior Nutrition through Amino Acids, makers of AgiPro-L, Dairyland Laboratories, and Virtus, makers of Strata with EPA DHA omega-3s and Prequel with omega-6s. Our bronze sponsors are Dairy One Forage Laboratory, AminoMax, Adiseo, Perdue Agribusiness, PMI, and Soychlor. Each of these companies support education and research worldwide. We hope you consider them in your formulation decisions. I'm now going to open the floor up for questions. I will unmute our panelists so that we can say hello to you all. So I'm unmuting you all, just letting you have a warning. So hi, Elena. Hi, Jonas.
Hi, Marianne.
Hello. Hello.
Hi, Jonas. All right.
Hey.
I'm going to, Elena, if you have some questions, I'll let you lead off. If you are waiting for some questions, I have a few in the question and answer window that I can go with.
Yeah, go ahead. I will do after you.
Okay. All right. Our first question is, how do you prevent C18-1 from being biohydrogenated in the rumen?
All right. Thanks for the question here. Well, first of all, I'd like to start acknowledging a lot of this research come from MSU and from Michigan State, and Dr. Locke, Dr. Adam Locke, and Dr. Andres Contreras has done very interesting research in the last few years on this area and generating a lot of these questions. So specifically, that's I would say is the $1 million question, right? How we make that oleic bypass. And what's important to understand is when you're feeding an unsaturated fatty acid, most of that unsaturated fatty acid in a normal condition will be biohydrogenated, and with oleic it's not different. What we did in some of our feeding trials was using calcium salts, a calcium salt technology to give a little extra protection to that oleic. So if you ask me, I don't think calcium salts are the best protection mechanism that we have, but probably today are the most cost-effective way that we have to give protection to that oleic or that unsaturated fatty acid that we want to bypass. The challenge will always be how much is really bypassed, right? And I would say it varies. It varies according to the diet, because what affects the stability in a salt, one of the major factors is pH, right? So diets where you have more challenge in keeping room pH, or you see more swings in room pH, they probably will have a greater dissociation of that salt, and that reduces protection. But basically that's the way we protect in some of our feeding trials. But that's an area that deserves future work, is looking, okay, how can we develop these strategies where we bypass that oleic acid.
Okay, thank you so much, Jonas. I have sort of a follow-up question from the same listener. How many grams of 18-1 is needed to be delivered post-ruminally to have the effect you described on insulin response loss, at body condition loss, etc.?
Okay, body condition loss. Yeah, that's as I said, it's very hard when you're feeding to actually predict how many grams you're delivering, right? And I think this is a great question, because it's not exactly how much you're feeding, right? But how much is actually reaching the intestine to be absorbed. So that's why we did some infusion trials, and I would say oleic acid has two major advantages, I would say, in terms of metabolism. One is in relationship to fatty acid digestibility. I didn't talk about fatty acid digestibility specifically here, but having oleic acid arriving to the intestine improves fatty acid digestibility. And in a dose response infusion trial with 20 grams post-ruminant, so infusing 20 grams, you already see some of those benefits in terms of digestibility. In terms of, in that study, they also measure insulin, and about those 20 grams bypass oleic was already enough to trigger a response in insulin. But that research was done in cows during the post-peak period, or cows starting the trial about 100 days in milk. In terms of early lactation cows, then when that trial that I showed that was done infusing in early lactation, the dose choosing there was 60 grams. So they infused 60 grams of oleic acid into the abomasum, and then you see that insulin response on the cows. So if I have today to give an answer to that, I'll give you a range. I believe is between 30 and 60 grams on that fresh cow, and I think that's where we are working. It's important to say that this is much lower than some of the levels that we're using in the past, and I think when you start going too high on some of these unsaturated fatty acids, then you may have a negative effect on some signaling molecules and affect intake. So again, I think the dose response is important. And I think our best guess today is between those 30 and 60 grams on that fresh cow in terms of delivering those between 30 and 60 grams of fatty acids or of oleic acid specifically in the intestine of that cow.
Okay, thank you so much, Jonas. I know that we have a lot of interest in just knowing what we should do. We get questions regularly in terms of nutritionists who are having herds maybe going on quota, and they're seeking to increase their components and not necessarily their milk production. I have a couple questions yet in my window, but I'm going to switch over to Elena Bonfante. She said she has some questions in Italy. So Elena, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Marianne. So my question is related with the first question you had. So you said that the salts, so the fat protected with calcium, are not the best choice, or not the best choice, the best protection strategy. So which one do you consider the best one if you are not concerned about costs?
Yeah. So commercially today we don't have any source, but if you look back, that is some coding mechanism that you could use to try to protect some differently some fatty acids. The problem is cost, right? So some of the coding technologies they may be promising moving forward, as long as we can drop some of the costs. So I think there is interest overall from the industry in some of these technologies, specifically when you talk about some of these essential fatty acids like omega-3s, and maybe oleic acid as well. As I said, I think also salt is a good available technology that we have in today's, is a technology that I recommend people to use because of cost. We just have to understand its limitations, right? We have to understand how we apply that in our nutritional program.
Okay, very good. Another question, if I may. About fat supplementation in the dry period, of course, probably, I mean, tell me if I'm wrong, but is it most cost effective to feed it in the close-up period, if it's possible to split the two groups? And which is your maximum level of fat in the diet that you will reach?
Okay, so yes, on the close-up period is where we tend to see more research and more positive results than feeding through the whole dry period. In terms of the level of supplementation, as I said, I think every time we're talking about fat, we have to understand to start with your basal diet, right? What are the basal ingredients that you have available that will change according to the geographic region, country that you're working with, and then you use supplemental fat. That's why I like to use the supplemental, because it should be strategically used to complement what you can achieve on your basal diet. And I think we learned in the last few years that I would say moderate levels of supplemental fat between 1 and 2% of diet dry matter usually are the ones that give us a better return over investment. So if you have a basal diet with a common basal diet between 2 and 3% of fatty acids, and then you have some other source of fat, like let's say safe source of fat like cottonseed, for example, you may increase that level, and then you have a supplemental fat on top of that. So working, most of the diets that I like to work is around 4.5–5% of total fatty acids on the diet. But again, that depends on the availability of some of these other source of fat, some of the conditions that's feeding, what exactly is your major objective. But in terms of level, and I think that's what the latest research is showing us, with all the fatty acids that I listed there, palmitic and stearic, with palmitic, with palmitic and oleic, the good response is when we usually work between 1 and 2% of diet dry matter. When we start to going over that, then we tend not to see the same response.
Okay. And the last one, so here in Italy, for example, we have several sources of fatty acids. from feed like linseed, soybean oil, and so on. So should I be more confident to use those sources in combination maybe with protected fat in the dry period?
I would say the classic academic response, right? It depends, and it depends. I don't know how is the milk payment in Italy, and I'm sorry, I don't know that. But the challenge when you start using free oils is then that level of feeding may reduce, because when you have free oil in the rumen, and soybean oil is a good example. Soybean oil is a source of omega-6, for example, but what happens is that when that free oil is on the rumen and you have a higher level of that can be toxic to the rumen microbes. The microbes do this process called biohydrogenation. That's basically they try to detoxify that fatty acid, and they saturate that unsaturated fatty acid through this process. But that depends on the level you're feeding. So you can have some negative consequences when you're feeding the free oil. That is basically, if you're feeding and you may be affecting negatively the rumen, and you may generate some of these trans fatty acids in the rumen, and those trans fatty acids will have a negative effect on milk fat synthesis. So if you're in a market where you're paid by components, or you receive some type of bonus by components, using the free oil may not be the best option because of that.
Yeah,
that's why Yep.
Yeah, I was wondering more on the dry period.
The dry period. Yeah. So during the dry period, then yeah, it would make sense, as long as we are not feeding a level that will negatively affect fiber and intake on those cows. But you mentioned, for example, linseed oil. There's some sources of omega-3 that are natural that you could use instead of using supplement fat, right? So in those situations, yes, I agree with you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Elena, for such good questions. I have a couple questions here. The first one, you talk about the ratio of palmitic to oleic and the 60 to 30 of the fatty acids in supplementation. But do you have some insight on what this ratio in the total diet would look like? As you answered in Elena's question, so often it depends on what else you have in the diet.
Yeah, exactly. So it depends a lot on what else you have in the diet. But in this case, most of our trials with the 630, we target 1.5% of diet dry matter. So you can think that if you have a 30% oleic in a 1.5 is about a half a point on the diet on your oleic acid when you're looking at dry matter base. So if you have a regular diet, a regular fresh diet between 0.5, 0.6% of oleic acid in the dry matter base, you're basically adding another 0.4, 0.5, bringing that oleic acid close to 1% of the total diet. But remember that we have to take some of that in consideration, is how much really of the oleic is bypassed, as we discussed before. In terms of the palmitic, then will be more or less the double amount, right? So in a basal diet, really you don't have more than 0.3, 0.4% of palmitic usually in a regular diet, unless you have some ingredients that will bring naturally palmitic acid, like cotton, for example. But if you have between 0.4 to percent, and you're adding about 0.9 and 1% palmitic on that total diet. So bringing really that palmitic oleic on your total diet to, I would say, 1.3% in dry matter base of palmitic acid, and about 0.9 to 1% of oleic acid. But again, this depends a lot on the dietary conditions that you have. And I think one thing that we have to do a better job is to understand what I mentioned at one of my summaries there is about interactions. This is one thing that I think becomes very important is to understand, is there an interaction when you add a specific supplement to what you already have on the diet? And that's the part that we have to do more research in understanding better those relationships.
Thank you, Jonas. Just a tip for you, Jonas. Most of the time, your speech is very clear and very well heard, but occasionally I think you may be turning away from the mic and things get a little muffled, so it might be hard for our listeners to hear. Thanks.
Okay.
I have one more question, and then if Paula doesn't have anything to follow up, we'll end our question period for this morning. What is your recommendation of fatty acids specific in terms of palmitic, oleic, and essential fatty acids, both during prepartum and postpartum, and for how many days postpartum? Sounds like you have a long answer in that one.
Yeah, this is a tough one, right? Because I would say involve multiple studies here to kind of think about an answer. I would say that we have been very interested in very mainly the ratio between palmitic and oleic during the lactation cycle, and I think they complement each other, palmitic and oleic. So as I showed, palmitic really has what we would say like a BST type of effect, right? You drive nutrients towards the mammary gland, usually increase fat yield on those cows. So specifically, how do you apply that is you should have higher levels of palmitic acid, I would say after that first month of lactation. So if I have to do a cutoff, I would say after that first month of lactation is where you should start increasing your palmitic acid level on the diet. I think on the first 30 days, there is benefits of combining the palmitic oleic. That is benefits of having some omega fatty acids as well, omega-3 specifically on the diets. I think in terms of pre-calving, we have to do some more work on that, but the major benefits that we usually see in pre-calving are more benefits in terms of reproduction when we combine with other technologies. But if there is ways that we can control some of that transition period, perhaps we don't need to be feeding fatty acids pre-calving and really focus on post-calving. So I would say the first 30 days is really where you're looking more to oleic acid, seems very promising. Looking to some of the omega fatty acids, they may, omega-3 specifically, may give you a nice response. And one thing that I like to point out is on some of the trials that we did on 24 days of lactation, and then we remove the supplemental fat, is that carryover effect. So the carryover is important because when you think about return over your investment, you have a carryover and you can drive the lactation cycle curve up, you usually have a positive response going forward. But those 30 days, I would say, would be where I would probably make a switch on my fatty acid ratio, which is not always easy on a farm, because you have farms where you're gonna have a high group feeding for the first 60 days, or you're gonna have a fresh group where the cows stay 2 to 3 weeks and then they move. So taking into consideration what the farm conditions are, it's important as well. And in most of the situations, we would have to choose one supplemental fat because you have one diet being fed throughout the whole lactation. But when we have these opportunities, I think using some of the knowledge on the ratios is important, and the oleic and omega-3s can probably give you the best answer together with palmitic at the beginning of lactation.
Oh, thank you, Jonas. I have a very interesting, what might be our final question is, given the different requirements, Did you have an opportunity, or have there been studies of the responses that may differ between primiparous and multiparous?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. To be honest, in this work that we have done with Palmitic and Palmitic oleic, we only use multiparous cows. So we haven't used some of those ratios in primiparous cows. There is some work going on now to try to see on the primiparous cows, which is interesting. First lactation cows, and I did some work with palmitic acid in primiparous cows. They have a different nutrition, a different partition of nutrients because of the physiological state. So when we feed palmitic acid for multiparous and primiparous cows at the same time, what we saw was that the first lactation cows, they respond less in milk, but they increase body weight change, even with palmitic acid. And that didn't happen with the multiparous cows. They partitioned all that extra energy towards milk. There was no change in body weight. So definitely the physiological state plays a very important role. In the primiparous cows, the first lactations, they may respond differently. We haven't quantified yet on these ratios what is that response, but given some of the research with the palmitic, I would guess that they respond differently, and that may indicate that perhaps it's more important to focus on changing some of these ratios to multiparous cows and less to first lactations. Yeah.
I wonder if a longer term study might reveal that those primiparous cows that responded with greater body weight gain actually showed improved production in their second
and third. Yeah, that would be really interesting to do. I'm not aware of anyone that actually did that, but that's an important point, right? And when you're in farms and you see variation on your first lactation, so in terms of you have farms where they will have first lactation cows more close to that 80-85% of mature body weight, or others where you have 7%. So perhaps there is something with fatty acids that can be done to help some of those farms to catch up, let's say, sooner. And perhaps, as Marian said, a good point would be perhaps you're not going to pay that in first lactation, but we'll show you a benefit on second or third. So.
Yeah, did those studies only look at production? Did they also look at breeding back, or coming back into the reproductive aspects of it?
Yeah, I would say most of the reproduction work has been done with omega fatty acids. With the other, we only have some of the metabolic indicators that we can do some suggestions of what perhaps happened with reproduction. But in terms of research, yeah, the only really truly measurements of reproduction that we have is with like omega-3 and omega-6, and most of those studies come from Florida. So even with palmitic acid, I'm not aware of any study that actually look to reproduction per se. And I think that's an important point that should be studied.
Okay. Well, I think unless somebody messages something rather rapidly, we are going to say that we're good for the morning. Thank you so much, Jonas and Elena. Thank you for joining us. We had Vadim earlier, but he left before he asked any questions. So thank you, everybody who attended. If you missed anything or want to hear more questions, tune in the afternoon, right around 6 o'clock if you have more questions you want to ask. I have a text from Marcelo that says he has lots of questions, but it's starting to rain now. So I'm not sure entirely what that means. Marcelo, are you still with us? He is not. So he had to go. So he has questions. Anyway, Paula, would you like to go ahead with your questions first?
I'm here, yes.
All right, go ahead, Paula. I've got a voice message from Marcelo that I'll listen to while you start speaking.
Thank you very much, Jonas. It was a very nice presentation. We have a lot of questions from here. So I will start with the first one. Which are the advantages and disadvantages of using calcium soaps in pre-fresh cows?
So advantages and disadvantages of calcium salts pre-fresh cows.
Yes.
The first thing we have to understand is that calcium salts is a technology, right? So you can make calcium salts from several different sources, from several different raw materials, okay? So it's hard to put them all in one group. So basically what calcium salt technology is was developed in early 80s to kind of being a protection mechanism of some unsaturated fatty acids in the rumen, right? So the most common brand probably that everyone knows is calcium salts of PFAD, like the Megalac type of products. So PFAD is a product from the palm oil, but you can make calcium salts from several different products, from several different raw materials, right? So across, my knowledge, you can have calcium salts of soybean oil, you can have calcium salts or fish oil, like some omega-3 type of products. You can have calcium salts of PFAD made from palm oil. So I would say to understand the benefits or the advantage and disadvantage, you have to first ask yourself, what is the profile of that calcium salt? What fatty acids they bring to the table, okay? So in some countries, and I'm from Brazil, I know you have like calcium salts of soybean oil, for example, right? Soybean oil is an omega-6 fatty acid, but you may have some challenges of working with that in terms of butter fat. So in terms of me giving a recommendation overall for calcium salts is the first thing you have to ask yourself about the calcium salt is what is the profile, what are the fatty acids in there, and then kind of in the summary of my presentation, look into where those fatty acids are and what's their effects.
Okay, Paula, do you want to keep going, or shall I see if Sean, Lee, or Vadim has questions?
I can do another one.
Okay, excellent. Keep going.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do calcium soaps have any effects on follicles in the cow?
Do calcium salts have? So yes, if you look to some of the research with calcium salts of omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids, some of the work that I showed from Florida, for example, and some of other work that is done with calcium salts of omega-6 and omega-3 sources, that is positive effects on that. But that doesn't mean that's going to happen with every calcium salt, right? So as I said, if you have a calcium salt of a different oil, it is not going to have the same effect. So you can have positive effect on reproduction, follicle response, as long as it's coming from a source with proven fatty acids, right? So omega-6 and omega-3s, and specifically omega-3s, they seem to have an effect. A positive effect, and there is a lot of work being done with omega-3, calcium salts of omega-3 fatty acids showing benefits on that.
Okay, Paula, shall I ask a couple questions so you can translate some, or do you want to keep going?
No, go on.
Okay, all right. I have a couple questions from Sean Lee in China. He said, what is the position of C18 supplement in dairy cows' diet?
What's the position?
Yes.
Okay, so C18 is stearic acid, right? So if you get in a normal diet on a dairy cow, it doesn't matter where you are. If you're feeding forage, corn, soybean, canola, grazing, usually stearic acid is gonna be the major fatty acid that the cow will have available for absorption. It doesn't mean that's the major fatty acid that the cow will eat. but because of the rumen biohydrogenation process, those unsaturated fatty acids that you have on corn, on forages, they will be mostly convert to stearic acid. Okay, so although stearic acid is, the intake of stearic acid, and if you get a nice nutrition program, like MTS, for example, and you can see the intake and estimate duodenal flow, you can see that you have a very low intake of stearic acid, usually on a diet, but you have a lot arrive into the intestine of the cow to be absorbed. So I would say stearic acid is an important fatty acid on the dairy cow diet. I think my point in terms of the supplementation is that usually you already have a lot of stearic acid. So perhaps that is room, and the research is showing that, to supplement some of the other fatty acids on the diet and take advantage of some of the other fatty acids. But stearic acid is a pretty important fatty acid.
Okay, thank you. A second question from Sean Lee. How much confidence do you have in the positive effects of the pro-inflammation of effect that omega-6 has prior to calving?
That's a good question. And if you look, I do think that most of the benefits is after calving with omega-3, but some of the work that was previously done in Florida show advantages or a better reproduction performance and better and reducing many pregnancy loss if you combine an omega-6 to an omega-3. My point is, you always have to consider in what conditions those cows usually are, right? So if you have cows that are managing well and transition well, they probably are in a good immune system type of response. You may not see that benefit. You may not need that fatty acid, but in more challenging conditions, that's when usually you can see the benefit. I would add on that as well that when you talk about omega-6, my only concern is how much you're feeding, right? Don't overfeed that as well, because you can have some negative effects when you start feeding too much of omega-6 or unsaturated fatty acids in terms of feed intake. And what we want on that transition period especially is getting the maximum intake response that we can. So I would say that the response is variable on the omega-6, and I think that has to do with the fact that it will depend on where those cows are in each condition.
Okay, terrific. Paula, do you want to do a couple questions? I still have more, but I want to give you a break in order to be able to do some translating later.
Okay, yes.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay. Which products guarantee a specific percentage of fatty acids like palmitic and oleic or others?
Which product? That's a tough one. I work for a company that sells that, right? I would say there's a lot of good companies in the market, and I would say you have to look. My recommendation would be go back to the companies that invest time and money on research, and you look back what they have, and then you can trace back on some of these supplements. And then every company will guarantee a level of fatty acid, total fatty acid, in a profile on there. And it's not a bad idea to get some of that supplement and get a sample analyzed in some lab to make sure that you're getting the profile that company is guaranteeing. But my main recommendation is it would be that make sure that you're using a product. If you're choosing to use a product from someone that invests time, money, and have research proven results. And as I said, there's a lot of good companies that would have that. So that would be my recommendation.
Very, very gracefully handled, Jonas. Go ahead, Paula.
Okay. Are all these fatty acids rumen protected? If so, do they have an interaction with other non-protected fatty acids of the diet, even if they don't exceed 5% of dry matter?
Wow, that's a wonderful question. Yes, one thing that I talk at the beginning of my presentation when I present palmitic and stearic acid, I talk about interactions with other dietary components. We did some research when I was at MSU, and we have some research going on looking to different dietary conditions. And yes, there is interactions between the fatty acid of a supplement and the fatty acid from my basal diet. And I'll give an example for, like in US, we use a lot of whole cotton seed in diets, right? So depending on your level of cotton, you get a good response in terms of butter fat, and that response can be better or not depending on the other fatty acids that you manipulate on the diet. And I think we need to do more of that work. And I think you can have, if you have a good source of I would say a safe fat like cotton, or a good source of roasted beans, that is potential interactions, and you should take advantage of that, because that the fat usually is cheaper, right? So you start with your basal diet, you have your cheaper fat, and then you supplement to complement your diet. And you ask about protection, right? So protection is a very hard topic, because for unsaturated fatty acids, the main technology that we have on the market is calcium salts, and that protection mechanism will vary based on two main things, right? The first one is what's the raw material. So for example, calcium salts of palm, they tend to be more protected than calcium salts of unsaturated fatty acids like soy, for example. But the major factor that affects that protection or that dissociation of the salt is pH. So that's why it becomes very, very variable. Because if you're feeding cows and you have dietary conditions where farms well managed, feed management is good, and you don't see too much variations like feeding, that rumen pH follows a normal pattern during the day, that protection, and using a salt, that protection of that salt is better. But if you have conditions where you have more variable feeding situations, that protection reduces. And thinking about some of you listening from Brazil or Argentina, where we have feeding system where sometimes we have you have a grazing condition, and then you supplement a concentrate in specific times of the day, that usually generates as well swings, or potentially can generate some of these swings in rumen pH, and that's also affect the protection. So giving a hard number on protection is complicated because of that. I know it's an academic response, but it depends. It depends on what conditions you are applying that.
Paula, do you mind if I ask a few questions and then we'll come back to more of yours?
Go on.
Okay, very good. I have another question from Sean Lee. He said, for high body condition transition cows, fat ones, any recommendations about using the fatty acids at different stages? For example, close up, fresh, peak, post peak time. What would be the most effective approach?
That's a good question. I would say, well, if you're having overconditioned cows, we have to try to fix that before, right? So trying to avoid that overcondition and late gestation, and then the main thing would be changing your starch level. But you also can manipulate your fatty acid profile. So in early lactation, as I show, you could use a combination. Probably driving some more oleic on that cow. Palmitic is important if you want to keep components high, and you can add some of these other omega-3 fatty acids. And then when cows start to enter in a positive energy balance, you can reduce some of these unsaturated fatty acids. So my recommendation would be you can feed less oleic, perhaps taking advantage of palmitic or even stearic acid, and try to use that as the lactation progress. Specifically, palmitic acid is very interesting because in post-peak cows we have very, very good data showing that it helps on partition nutrients to the mammary gland and helps to reduce some of the overconditioning. That is even some work that was done in Michigan State before I was there, and it's published data where on late lactation cows, one nice alternative was you could feed more forage on your diet with palmitic acid. Would be better in terms of an indirect milk and keeping and avoiding overconditioned cows than feeding a high starch diet. So you can, for example, reduce your starch and keep your energy, increasing a palmitic acid, for example, feeding some more forage. So you should be varying. If you have the opportunity, you should be feeding one fat supplement throughout the whole lactation. Ideally, we should vary. And I think specifically early lactation in post-peak cows, that is some opportunities that we could do with the knowledge of the fatty acid that we know now.
Thank you. That seems very well responded. A question from Vadim: at what level of milk production would you recommend adding fatty acids?
So that's a tricky one as well, right? And I think that depends on a couple factors, right? I think it depends mainly on the economics. So understanding your payment system. I know depending on the country, and we have participants here from different countries, but understanding how you get paid for your milk and what's the advantage is the first factor. Then production level. Production level becomes very important. We did a couple trials with production level, and we have cows. If you look to some of our trials, between 25 kilograms to 7 kilograms, right? And the cows respond to different combinations of fatty acids. Which is interesting is that as production level increases, cows seems to respond better to palmitic and oleic than some of other fatty acids. But I would say to you that I did some work back in Brazil with grazing cows, and we got good responses in cows producing 20 to 25 kilograms as well. So I think it depends a lot on the economics, how you get paid, what's the price of that supplement to try to identify the response.
Okay, thank you so much. I have one final question in my window so far. Actually, two. One is a comment. Mike Hutchins says, "Great webinar. Will you be willing to make the PDF, the presentation, available as a PDF?" I think I asked you that, but I can't remember your response.
Yes.
Okay, so Mike, when we get this up as an archived webinar, I will have a link to the PDF that you can download. The next question is, the palmitic and oleic acids used in your research, were they calcium salts?
So the research with high palmitic acid is not calcium salts. So it's a Perdue technology. Basically, when you fractionate palm, you increase that concentration of palmitic. You can use a Perdue technology instead of using calcium salt. For unsaturated fatty acids, then yes, you need to use something that will give some type of protection, and then we use calcium salt. The last trial that I showed on the palmitic oleic blends there for fresh cows, that's 630, that is a supplement that delivers that 630, 6% palmitic, 30% oleic as a full calcium salt. So it's a new supplement that's in the market. So it depends on the trial here, but most of the oleic acid, yes, it was calcium salt. Most of the palmitic was a Perdue fatty acid.
Okay, thank you, Jonas. Paula, I don't have more questions right now. Do you want to take it away again?
Yes, I have a lot of questions.
I see.
Yes, yes. I'm writing them down. Okay. One about calcium salts. Do calcium salts have any effect on estrogen and or progesterone in dairy cows?
Estrogen or progesterone. So again, if you look back to some of the work, and I can send to who's asking some of the papers here, when they look back, with calcium salts of omega-3, yes, that is a fact. But calcium salts of palm, no, that is no effect. So again, it depends on the profile, right? So it depends on the profile. And there's some nice research that was done on that. There's some papers published in the Journal of Dairy Science, and I can share that those results, right? Where there's changes in progesterone and that were really related with that trial that I showed with the reduction in pregnancy loss.
Jonas, if you want to send links to those papers to me, when I send out notice to everybody who's attended the webinar that the recording's ready, I can include those in the email.
Okay, no, I can do that. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Go ahead, Paula.
Okay, and just a few more about calcium salt. Does calcium salt particle size affect its quality?
Another contradictory topic. I would say yes and no. So I'll try to explain. Yes, there is some research showing that calcium salts particle size is important, and that seems to be more important as the unsaturated fatty acid level increases. So there is some, and I also can send a paper. There's a paper was published 2 years ago looking to calcium salt of an omega-3 source and having a larger particle size gives some more protection to that omega-3. So for some of these unsaturated fatty acids that we try to keep having a better protection, I think particle size becomes more important. If it's a regular calcium salts of palm, I think that is less, we have less confidence that that really is important because palm, because of the bounding of the salt, palm usually we usually don't see the same results, but a lot of these is also tested in vitro, where I have sometimes challenge with some of the methodology, but then you know, I think the cow is always your best measurement. I've been working with calcium salts of different particle size, and I see very little difference in terms of using a calcium salt of palm oil, palm fatty acids, regardless of the particle size that I'm using. But I think it becomes more important for the omegas.
Okay. The last one, which is the recommended level of calcium salts to increase meat yield?
The question was about what the level of calcium salt I should have to see milk response, right?
Yes.
So if you get, there's a couple years ago, a meta-analysis that was published with calcium salts of palm fatty acids, and they saw, you know, there was a variable response. I think the average was about 2% of diet dry matter that they include. That was increasing milk yield on that meta-analysis. I think the first factor to determine if you're going to see response or not is the profile, right? Is understanding what are the fatty acids in that calcium salt or that material that you're using. But we, for example, with calcium salts of palm combined with some other fatty acids, we see good responses using between half a percent to 1%. On the diet in most of the cases. I think when you start going very high levels, and that's where people can get lost sometimes, you know, thinking that you're gonna see more if you feed more. You may start having some issues depending on the profile on feed intake, right? And that offsets some of the gain that you can have. And a good example is this is this 630 blend, for example, is taking oleic up to 30%, or that would be a 0.5% on a dyed dry matter basis. Has shown very good results, but when we try to go over that, sometimes we don't see the same response because feed intake drops. So feed intake becomes important as a measurement as well there.
Okay, Paula, do you have more questions?
Yes, I have
Okay,
more.
and then I'll have one or two. Go ahead.
Okay. At what age can we start feeding fat? Is it recommended in heifers or only when milking?
At what age?
Yes.
So I don't see too much feeding fat in heifers, for example, or in growing animals, and I think that has a lot to do with economics. And really, I think if you have a well-managed program, I think fat becomes expensive for you. I think there's other ways you can achieve targets of body weight gain without using supplemental fat. Then I think supplemental fat becomes more as a tool for you in terms of managing lactation and pre-lactation production. So that is important. That is difference as well on premium first lactations versus older cows in terms of some of the profile that we use. And that's important as well. Usually the response to fat, so first lactations, they usually respond less in milk, but we usually see growth, a faster growth on those cows. They gain weight. And that doesn't seem to be the same response in multiparous cows, depending on the profile that you use, of course. But that's important because if you only measure milk and milk components and you don't value some of these other factors that you have to consider some of these other metabolic effects. But if you're chasing production, I'd say multiparous cows respond better, and I would focus on lactation in terms of supplemental fat.
Okay, thank you. I have a question from Alberto. If palm oil is supplemented, no protected palm oil, would you expect a different response of supplementation with a base diet of 2% fat level?
It cuts a little bit your question. Can you just...
Yeah, let me try that again. If palm oil is supplemented, I think he means not protected palm oil, would you expect a different response to supplementation with a base diet of 2% fat level?
Yeah, so palm oil, if you get the profile of palm oil, right, you have about 45% of palmitic acid, and then you have some stearic acid there, but the profile is about 50-50 in terms of saturated and unsaturated fatty acids, right? So if you are only feeding the crude oil without a protection, what my concern becomes that mostly of that unsaturated fatty acids and oleic acid that the palm oil has will be biohydrogenated, and you lose some of the benefits of some specific fatty acids. So I don't think it's the same response using crude palm oil than using a supplement that's protected or that adds some type of protection on that. Of course, if you're not going, you have to trace what other fatty acids you have on the diet, what your RUFO levels are, and then you can take that, and cost, of course, and take that decision. But if you want to take advantage of the oleic acid, for example, that you have in the palm oil, it would be better if it's in a protected form than in free oil.
Okay, thank you. Paula, take it away.
Yes, okay. In the case we could add glucose or another rumen-protected sugar that gets into the gut, can it improve the effect of the palmitic plus oleic acid supplementation?
That's an interesting question. So my challenge would be if you look back to some other, not in dairy, but in research that was done with steers in the past, and you're changing corn processing, for example, and you try to increase glucose in the small intestine, right? What becomes happening is that glucose is mainly used on the omental fat that you have on the intestine, right? So I'm not really sure if that would add any benefit, because the fat of oleic acid, mainly in combination with palmitic, it seems to be specifically in some tissues. And we did, and the good example is this work that has been done at MSU, looking to adipose tissue, so measuring what's the response on tissue specific. So I really don't think that they complement each other. Maybe I'm wrong, and there's some research opportunity to do that. But I think that the effect that oleic acid has not directly to do with carbohydrate metabolism. It has to do to specific effects on tissues and insulin sensitivity of those tissues. So if the adipose tissue become less resistant to the action of the insulin, then usually you improve lipogenesis, you reduce lipolysis, you reduce that pool of fatty acids that would be mobilized when you have lactation, and that's what we think that helps with feed intake on those cows. If you have a lower pool of NIFA, the liver function occurs better. And that's usually that probably results in a better feed intake. So yeah, I think the effect of the oleic with palmitic is more tissue specific and not in the gut.
Okay. Do you think is it better glycogenic or lipogenic diet for to have a better reproduction during freshening?
Glucogenic or lipogenic diet. So I don't think we have to go to the extremes, right? And when you see some of these trials that they do lipogenic diets versus glucogenics, if you see the example that I gave, in the lipogenic diet, you have 10% of starch. I wouldn't feed that level of starch, a low level of starch for early lactation cows, right? I think there is some nice work in terms of starch levels. Looking, if you look to some of Dr. Oba, recent research, Dr. Mike Allen, looking to that starch level and starch fermentability and how that regulates feed intake, which is important. So I would say while we can combine the approach, feed a moderate level of starch in the right profile of fatty acids, that's probably a better combination than going to the extreme of feeding, a very high starch diet or a very high fat diet. So trying to work on that middle, I think, and taking advantage of the fatty acids and starch together is better than going to lipogenics versus glucogenic.
Great, Jonas. And the last question from here, could we replace oleic acid by linoleic acid having the same effect?
That's a good question. We haven't done research with that, and I think if you look back to the literature, I don't think so. I don't think they have the same effect. Linoleic acid is the major fatty acid that the cow will usually has the intake of the major fatty acids usually linoleic acid, right? And higher levels of linoleic acid in the rumen, if they are unprotected, they can generate you some problems. Oleic acid as well at the higher levels unprotected in the rumen, they may also have some negative effects, but I think the effects are specific regarding the oleic. And if you go to the human literature, you're gonna see some support to that. That the oleic is an omega-9 fatty acids, and you have some benefits of that. So I think it's a specific. These specific effects on insulin, and the benefit of that is specific to oleic acid, and I don't think you're gonna see the same response in oleic.
Paula, did you mean to clarify something?
Yes.
Go ahead.
No, the Ariel meant protected fatty acids.
Oh, he meant protected fatty acids. Yeah. So, I think they are not the same metabolically. So, if you get a source of oleic acid, for example, and you get a source for linoleic soybean oil, for example, they don't have the same metabolic effect, and that specifically, I think, is is to the profile. So we do see some responses with oleic acid that we don't with linoleic. And specifically this action that I show on insulin and complementing that, if you go back to some of the human literature, they already have, we already have supporting mechanisms for why this happened with the oleic, but it doesn't seem to happen with other fatty acids. So yeah, even if you're feeling protected in a salt, for example, the metabolic effect is not the same.
Okay, Paula, it
Thank you
looks
very
like
much.
maybe, yeah, it looks like you've come to the end of your questions.
Yes, a lot of questions, many questions.
Yeah, this was terrific. Yeah, and we had so many good panelists joining. Unfortunately, Marcelo kept sending me videos of how much it was raining in Brazil. So, Jonas, maybe the snow is better?
No.
No. Where are you, Jonas?
I am home. I live in Utah.
Oh, so no snow.
Yeah.
Okay, we got some snow in the night.
We are in defrosting mode now, but it's been 6 years in US and it's still haven't figured out the snow yet.
Yeah. I don't think it's possible to figure out the snow if you're from Brazil.
No.
Okay. Paula, thank you for joining. Sean, thank you. And Jonas, I'm going to send you a quick email when we get off. And thank you, everybody who are still there. I will send you an email. We hope to see everybody back next month in March. So thanks, everybody, and have a good night.
Yep. I would like just to thank everyone, and you guys, I will make my slides available. That is my email there if someone wants to discuss further. Okay.
Yes, I'll put your email in the outgoing letter as well. So do you want me to put both in?
Yeah.
Very good. Okay. Excellent. All right. Thank you so much, Jonas. And thank you, everybody who joined us. Without any other questions, I'll say goodbye.